In the depths of space, where civilizations measure their worth by the sharpness of their claws and the strength of their scales, humanity was considered nothing more than a cosmic joke. Soft-skinned, weak-boned, and pitifully short-lived, humans were the galaxy's newest laughingstock. But sometimes, the universe has a twisted sense of humor. Sometimes, the prey becomes the predator. Sometimes, those who mock the seemingly defenseless discover that evolution doesn't always favor the obvious. What happens when a species that survived ice ages, plagues, and their own wars finally shows the galaxy what they're truly capable of? What happens when the hunted becomes the hunter and the meek inherit not just the Earth, but the stars themselves? This is the story of how humanity's greatest strength was never their technology, their numbers, or their weapons. It was something far more terrifying to a galaxy built on hierarchy and power: their absolute refusal to kneel. The Grand Hall of the Karathi Imperial Command buzzed with the usual mixture of intimidation and arrogance that defined the Galactic Empire's elite. Towering pillars of black stone stretched toward a ceiling that disappeared into shadows, while holographic displays cast an eerie blue glow across the assembled crowd of alien dignitaries. The air itself seemed thick with superiority, as creatures from dozens of worlds gathered to witness what many considered to be nothing more than an elaborate joke. Commander Zurathek stood at the center of it all, her 7-foot frame casting an imposing shadow across the polished floor. Her scales, a deep crimson that spoke of noble bloodline, caught the light as she gestured dismissively toward the viewing screen. Her 4 arms moved with practiced grace, each motion calculated to display both her physical superiority and her contempt for what she was observing. "Look at them," she hissed, her voice carrying the distinctive rasp that made the Karathi language sound like grinding metal. "The humans think they can stand among us as equals. These soft-skinned weaklings who barely discovered faster-than-light travel a few decades ago." The screen showed a formation of human ships approaching the station. They were smaller than most vessels in the Imperial fleet, their designs utilitarian rather than impressive. Where Karathi ships bristled with visible weapons and armor plating designed to strike fear into enemies, the human vessels looked almost civilian in their simplicity. No threatening spikes, no intimidating color schemes, just clean lines and efficient engineering. Around Zarathek, other high-ranking officers and nobles murmured their agreement. The Karathi had built their empire on the principle that might made right, and everything about humanity seemed to contradict their natural order. Humans were smaller than most species, weaker than almost all of them, and their lifespans were laughably short by galactic standards. To the Karathi way of thinking, they had no business being in space at all, let alone requesting an audience with the Imperial High Command. "I heard their home planet doesn't even have a proper warrior caste," commented General Vexhai, his massive frame dwarfing even Zarathek. His species, the Brutari, stood nearly 8 feet tall and possessed natural armor plating that could deflect most small arms fire. They let their weak govern their strong. "It's unnatural." Zarathek's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among her people. Even more pathetic, they claimed to have no slaves at all. Can you imagine? A civilization without proper hierarchy? Without natural order? She gestured toward the screen again, where the lead human ship was requesting docking permission. They'll learn soon enough how the galaxy really works. The human delegation that eventually made its way into the Imperial Hall was everything the Karathi expected and more. They were small, averaging barely 6 feet in height, with pale skin that looked vulnerable even under their uniforms. Their leader, identified as Colonel Marcus Chun, walked with what the aliens interpreted as the nervous gait of prey entering a predator's den. What the Karathi couldn't understand was that Colonel Chin's measured pace wasn't born of nervousness, but of careful observation. His eyes, a brown so dark they appeared almost black, took in every detail of the hall. The positioning of guards, the layout of exits, the subtle displays of wealth and power that decorated every surface. Chin had spent 30 years in military service, including campaigns that would have broken the spirit of most sentient beings. He knew how to read a room, and this room was practically screaming its intentions. Behind Chun walked 6 other humans, each wearing the same simple blue uniforms that bore no resemblance to the ornate military dress of other galactic species. There were no medals, no ceremonial weapons, no displays of rank beyond simple insignia. To the assembled aliens, they looked like servants or clerks rather than military representatives. Zarathek stepped forward as the human delegation reached the center of the hall. The traditional greeting ceremony of the Karathi Empire required visitors to kneel and acknowledge the superiority of their hosts. It was a ritual that every species in the known galaxy had performed, from the proud warrior clans of the Nexari to the ancient scholars of the Viridian Collective. None had ever refused. Humans, Zarathek's voice echoed through the hall, amplified by the chamber's acoustics to ensure maximum impact. You stand in the presence of the Karathi Imperial Command, rulers of 300 worlds and masters of 1,000 species. By ancient law and custom, you will kneel and acknowledge your place in the natural order of the galaxy. The silence that followed was absolute. Every alien in the hall watched with anticipation, some with barely concealed glee at the thought of watching these upstart humans learn their place. Others observed with scientific curiosity, wondering how quickly this new species would adapt to galactic realities. Colonel Chun remained standing, his posture relaxed but alert. His response, when it came, was delivered in perfect galactic standard, his accent carrying the flat, matter-of-fact tone that would become legendary throughout the Empire in the months to come. "We appreciate the invitation to speak with your command structure," Chun said calmly. "However, humans don't kneel to anyone but their own dead, and only then to honor their sacrifice." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the hall as creatures from across the galaxy tried to process what they had just heard. Refusal to kneel wasn't just unprecedented, it was incomprehensible. Zarathek's scales darkened to a deeper red, a clear sign of rising anger among her people. "You misunderstand your position, human. This is not a request. This is the law of the Empire. Every species kneels. Every civilization acknowledges their betters. You are no exception." "Actually," Chun replied, his voice never changing from conversational tone, "we are the exception. Humans don't recognize the concept of betters based on physical strength or age of civilization. We judge worth by actions, not by the size of one's claws or the thickness of one's hide." The chamber erupted in angry chittering, roaring, and other sounds of alien outrage. Several species took Chen's words as a direct insult to their evolutionary advantages. The Karathi, in particular, seemed to view the humans' refusal as a challenge to the very foundation of their empire. General Vexhai stepped forward, his massive form casting Chun and his delegation into shadow. "Perhaps you don't understand what happens to those who refuse to show proper respect," he growled, his voice like grinding stone. "The Empire has ways of teaching manners to the ignorant." For the first time since entering the hall, Colonel Chun smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression, and several of the more perceptive aliens in the crowd felt an unexpected chill at the sight of it. Throughout human history, that particular smile had been the last thing seen by countless enemies, from ancient battlefields to modern combat zones. "General," Chun said, his tone remaining conversational despite the obvious threat, "I think you're the one who doesn't understand. We're not here because we're weak or ignorant. We're here because we're giving you a chance to avoid finding out what happens when you threaten a species that evolved by surviving everything their own world could throw at them." The human delegation's posture shifted subtly, and suddenly, the aliens found themselves looking at something different from what they had initially perceived. These weren't nervous diplomats or frightened primitives. These were soldiers, and the ease with which they had positioned themselves for maximum tactical advantage while appearing casual was deeply unsettling to those few in the crowd with actual military experience. Zarathek's forearms tensed as she began to realize that this encounter wasn't following the script that had played out with every other species the Empire had encountered. The humans weren't behaving like prey. They weren't showing fear, awe, or even proper respect for the obvious physical superiority of their hosts. Instead, they carried themselves with the quiet confidence of apex predators, despite their seemingly fragile appearance. "You dare threaten the Karathi Empire?" Zarathek demanded, her voice rising to a near shriek. We who have conquered worlds when your species was still crawling in mud. We who command fleets that could reduce your entire planet to ash. Chin's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that he found the commander's words amusing rather than intimidating. Commander, with respect, you're making the same mistake that a lot of species have made throughout galactic history. You're confusing age with experience, size with strength, and conquest with survival. The colonel took a single step forward, and despite being dwarfed by every alien in the hall, somehow managed to command the attention of the entire room. Humans have been fighting wars since before we discovered fire. We've survived ice ages, plagues, natural disasters, and our own worst impulses for hundreds of thousands of years. We didn't conquer our world through overwhelming physical advantages or natural weapons. We did it through adaptation, innovation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. The hall had grown quieter as Chun spoke, and many of the aliens found themselves listening despite their initial dismissal of human capabilities. There was something in the colonel's voice that suggested depths they hadn't initially perceived, layers of meaning that went beyond simple bravado. Every species in this room evolved to fill a specific niche on their home world, Chun continued. You developed size, armor, claws, or other natural advantages that made you dominant in your environment. Humans evolved to survive in every environment, against every possible threat, through pure adaptability and ruthless efficiency. He gestured around the hall, taking in the assembled crowd of alien dignitaries. You see weakness where you should see the most dangerous trait any species can possess, the ability to adapt to any situation, overcome any obstacle, and win any fight through intelligence rather than brute force. General Vex High let out a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so deeply intimidating. Intelligence means nothing without the strength to enforce it. Human. Pretty words won't save your species when the Imperial fleets arrive at your world. The smile that crossed Chin's face this time was different from the first one, and several aliens in the crowd took involuntary steps backward despite themselves. General, you're making a critical error in judgment. You're assuming that because humans appear physically weaker than most galactic species, we're somehow less dangerous. That's the kind of thinking that got the last empire that threatened humanity turned into radioactive dust and historical footnotes. The silence that followed Chin's words was different from the previous quiet moments. This was the kind of silence that comes when predators suddenly realize they might be looking at an even more dangerous predator, one that simply doesn't look the part. Zarathek's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation among her people. The humans' casual mention of destroying an entire empire was either the height of foolish bravado or a statement of fact that carried terrifying implications. Given the humans' complete lack of fear in the face of overwhelming odds, she was beginning to suspect it might be the latter. You speak of destroyed empires, she said carefully, but humans have only recently achieved interstellar travel. What empire could you possibly have encountered, let alone defeated? Chin's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering how much to reveal. Commander, humans didn't just recently achieve interstellar travel. We achieved it, lost it, achieved it again, improved it, and then decided whether or not to announce ourselves to the galactic community. We've been watching, learning, and preparing for this moment for longer than most of your species realize. The implications of Chin's words sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. If humans had possessed interstellar capability for any significant length of time, their apparent weakness and isolation took on an entirely different meaning. A species that could remain hidden while observing galactic civilization was either incredibly advanced or incredibly paranoid. Either possibility suggested capabilities that went far beyond what the assembled aliens had initially assumed. As for the empire we destroyed, Chun continued conversationally, that would be our own. Humans have a rather unfortunate tendency to fight wars with themselves that make most galactic conflicts look like children's games. We've developed weapons and tactics through necessity that most species couldn't even comprehend, let alone defend against. The human colonel's matter-of-fact tone made his words even more chilling. He wasn't boasting or threatening. He was simply stating facts as if discussing the weather. The casual way he mentioned species-level self-conflict suggested a level of internal warfare that bordered on the incomprehensible. "We learned a long time ago," Chun said, his voice carrying a note of what might have been sadness, "that the universe is a hostile place, and that survival belongs to those willing to do whatever it takes to protect what they value. We value our independence above all else, and we become very good at preserving it." Zarathek found herself in the unprecedented position of feeling uncertain about how to proceed. The standard Imperial protocol for dealing with defiant species involved an overwhelming show of force followed by a subjugation or extermination. But something about the humans suggested that following standard protocol might not produce standard results. The commander's uncertainty was shared by many others in the hall. The assembled aliens represented some of the most powerful species in the galaxy, creatures who had built their reputations on strength, cunning, and the ability to dominate lesser beings. Yet somehow, these small, seemingly fragile humans had managed to seize control of the conversation and the room through nothing more than quiet confidence and carefully chosen words. What none of the aliens could know was that Colonel Chun and his delegation had been preparing for this moment for years. Human intelligence services had been studying galactic civilization, learning its strengths and weaknesses, and developing strategies for exactly this scenario. They knew that empires built on intimidation and brute force had predictable responses to challenges, and they had planned accordingly. As the silence stretched on, Chun made a show of checking a device on his wrist. "Commander, we appreciate the opportunity to introduce ourselves to the Imperial Command, but we do have other appointments. Perhaps we should conclude our business here." The casual dismissal was like a slap in the face to creatures accustomed to being treated with absolute deference. Zarathek's scales began to shift toward the deep purple that indicated killing rage among her people, and several other aliens in the crowd began displaying their own species' signs of aggression. "You will not dismiss this assembly," Zarathek snarled, her forearms spreading wide in a threat display that had terrified countless other species. "You will kneel, acknowledge Imperial authority, and submit to proper judgment for your insolence." Shen looked around the hall one more time, his gaze taking in the displays of alien aggression with the practiced eye of a career soldier. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of finality that somehow managed to cut through the rising tension. "Commander, I'm going to say this one more time, as clearly as possible, so there's no misunderstanding. Humans don't kneel. We don't acknowledge the authority of those who demand submission through force. And we don't submit to judgment by those who mistake cruelty for strength." The human colonel took another step forward, and this time several aliens actually moved back despite their size advantages. "What we do is give everyone we encounter one chance to treat us with the same respect we show them. This is that chance. What happens next depends entirely on how you choose to respond." The threat implicit in Chen's words was all the more effective for being delivered in the same conversational tone he had maintained throughout the encounter. There was no bluster, no dramatic gestures, no obvious displays of aggression. Just a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of absolute certainty. For a moment, the Grand Hall of the Karathi Imperial Command balanced on a knife's edge. Every being present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that refused to be intimidated, regardless of the odds against them. What happened next would determine whether humanity joined the ranks of conquered species or carved out an entirely new category in the galaxy's understanding of power and strength. The choice, as Colonel Chun had made clear, belonged entirely to the Karathi Empire. The tension in the Imperial Hall reached its breaking point as Zarathek's scales shifted to the deep purple of killing rage. Her forearms moved in the ritualistic pattern that preceded a formal challenge to combat, and her mandibles clicked in the rapid staccato that meant death was coming. Around the hall, other Karathi officers began to mirror her movements, creating a symphony of clicking and scraping that had preceded the destruction of countless enemies. "Human," Zarathek's voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the massive chamber. "You have made the greatest mistake in your species' short existence. You have insulted the honor of the Karathi Empire in the presence of our allies and vassals. There is only one response to such brazen disrespect." The commander's lower right arm moved to the ceremonial weapon at her side, a curved blade that had been forged from the bones of the last species foolish enough to challenge Karathi authority. The metal had been treated with acids that would cause excruciating pain before death, and the weapon had never failed to elicit screams of terror when displayed. Colonel Chin watched the display with the same calm attention he had shown throughout the encounter. If anything, the obvious preparations for violence seemed to relax him rather than increase his tension. To the more observant aliens in the crowd, this reaction was deeply unsettling. Species that had evolved as prey animals showed fear when faced with predators. Species that had evolved as predators showed aggression when challenged. Humans, apparently, showed a kind of patient interest that suggested they were evaluating tactical options. "Commander," Chin said quietly, "are you absolutely certain this is the path you want to take? Because once we go down this road, there's no turning back for either of our species." The question was delivered with the same conversational tone Chun had maintained throughout the encounter, but something in his voice caused several of the alien observers to exchange worried glances. The human wasn't pleading or trying to negotiate. He was offering a final warning, the way a professional might warn an amateur before demonstrating the difference in their capabilities. Zarathek's response was to draw her ceremonial blade and hold it high above her head. The weapon caught the chamber's lighting and threw back reflections that danced across the walls like imprisoned lightning. The gesture was meant to demonstrate her readiness to kill and die for the honor of the Empire, but the human's complete lack of reaction to the display was beginning to unnerve even her. "The Karathi Empire has never retreated from inferior beings," she declared, her voice now pitched to carry to recording devices that would broadcast her words throughout Imperial space. "We who have conquered the fierce Nexari warriors, who have tamed the brutal Skarn berserkers, who have broken the will of 1,000 proud species, will not be intimidated by soft-skinned primitives who think words can replace strength." The speech was everything her people expected from their military leaders: proud, uncompromising, and contemptuous of weakness in all its forms. The assembled crowd of alien dignitaries murmured their approval, and several species that owed allegiance to the Empire began their own threat displays in support of their Karathi overlords. Chen waited until the noise died down before responding, and when he spoke, his words carried a note of genuine sadness that caught many of the aliens off guard. "You know, Commander, that's almost exactly what the Dominion said when they first encountered humans. Word for word, in some cases. They also had centuries of successful conquest behind them, subject species that feared their very name, and absolute confidence in their superiority." The human colonel paused, as if remembering something painful. "It took us 3 days to destroy their entire civilization. We've gotten more efficient since then." The casual mention of destroying an entire civilization in 3 days sent a chill through the crowd that had nothing to do with the chamber's climate control. Several species began to recalculate their assessment of human capabilities, while others dismissed Chen's claim as obvious bluffing. The problem was that nothing in the human's demeanor suggested he was lying. General Vex High, whose people had built their reputation on personal combat prowess, stepped forward to support his Karathi allies. His massive frame cast shadows across the human delegation, and his natural armor plating was scarred from countless battles. Among the Brutari, such scars were marks of honor that testified to both survival and victory in personal combat. "Humans speak of destroying civilizations," he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder, "but they have no scars, no marks of battle, no proof of their claimed prowess. They're soft creatures who hide behind machines and clever words because they lack the courage for honest combat." The general's assessment seemed reasonable to most of the assembled aliens. The humans did appear unmarked by battle, their skin showing none of the ritual scarification or natural damage that most warrior species accumulated over their lifetimes. Their uniforms were clean and unmarked, bearing none of the battle honors or campaign ribbons that decorated the clothing of experienced fighters. Chen's response to the general's challenge was to slowly roll up his left sleeve, revealing an arm that told a very different story than his clean uniform suggested. The human's pale skin was marked with scars that formed a complex pattern of healed wounds, surgical marks, and what appeared to be burn damage. But it was the small, neat row of tattooed marks running along his forearm that drew gasps of recognition from several species in the crowd. Each mark was a simple black line, precisely placed, and carefully rendered. To most galactic species, they would have seemed like mere decoration, but several of the more militaristically inclined aliens recognized them for what they were: kill marks. Each line represented a confirmed enemy death, and there were far more lines than should have been possible for such a young species. "General," Chin said quietly, "humans don't scar the same way most species do. Our medical technology is too advanced to leave most wounds untreated. But we keep other records of our experiences." He gestured to the marks on his arm. "These represent personal combat kills, confirmed enemy deaths in face-to-face engagements. They don't include casualties from orbital bombardments, planetary sieges, or fleet actions." The human colonel began rolling down his sleeve, but not before several sharp-eyed observers noticed that the marks continued up his arm, disappearing beneath the fabric in numbers that seemed impossible for any individual to have accumulated. "The reason humans don't show obvious battle damage," Chun continued, "is because we've learned that the most effective warriors are those who win their fights without taking damage in return. We call it tactical superiority, and it served us well in situations where raw physical strength wasn't enough." The explanation sent another ripple of unease through the crowd. Most galactic species viewed battle scars as marks of honor, proof of courage, and survival in honest combat. The idea of warriors who emerged from battle unmarked suggested either cowardice or such overwhelming superiority that the enemy never had a chance to inflict damage. Zarathek's mandibles clicked in what might have been nervous laughter. "You speak of tactical superiority as if it excuses weakness. But tactics mean nothing when faced with overwhelming force. The Empire commands fleets that number in the thousands, armies that span star systems, weapons that can crack the cores of planets. What do humans have to match such power?" The question was clearly meant to be rhetorical, a demonstration of imperial might that would finally force the humans to acknowledge their hopeless position. Instead, Chen appeared to give it serious consideration, as if he were actually weighing the relative merits of human versus imperial capabilities. "Well," Chan said finally, "humans have something that most galactic civilizations seem to have forgotten: the ability to learn from our mistakes. We've studied imperial tactics, analyzed your strategic doctrine, and identified several critical weaknesses in your operational philosophy." The human's clinical assessment of imperial military capabilities was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he had used throughout the encounter, but the implications were staggering. He was suggesting that humans had not only studied the Empire's military, but had found it wanting. "For example," Chun continued, "imperial strategy relies heavily on intimidation and the assumption that superior firepower will guarantee victory. Your fleets are designed for maximum visual impact rather than tactical efficiency. Your armies are organized around individual prowess rather than coordinated effectiveness. And your weapons, while impressive, prioritize dramatic effect over practical lethality." Each point Shin raised was delivered as a simple observation rather than a criticism, but the cumulative effect was to suggest that the entire imperial military doctrine was fundamentally flawed. Several alien observers began to shift uncomfortably as they recognized elements of their own military traditions in the human's critique. In contrast, Chun said, "Human military doctrine is based on the principle that any fight worth having is worth winning quickly, efficiently, and with minimum casualties to our own forces. We don't fight to prove our courage or honor our ancestors or demonstrate our superiority. We fight to eliminate threats to our people and our way of life, and we use whatever methods are most effective to achieve that goal." The human colonel's explanation of human military philosophy was deeply disturbing to species that viewed warfare as a test of personal or cultural strength. The idea of fighting purely to achieve practical objectives, without regard for honor or tradition, suggested a level of cold calculation that went against everything most galactic civilizations believed about proper conduct. Zarathek's scales had begun to shift toward the deep black that indicated extreme emotional distress among her people. The humans' calm dissection of imperial military doctrine was more unsettling than open threats would have been, because it suggested a level of preparation and analysis that went far beyond simple bravado. "You analyze our forces as if you have had opportunity to study them," she said carefully. "But humans have had no contact with imperial fleets. How could you know our tactical doctrine?" Chen's smile returned, and this time it carried an edge that made several aliens take involuntary steps backward. Commander, humans have been observing galactic civilization for much longer than we've been participating in it. We know your tactical doctrine because we've watched you use it. We know your strategic capabilities because we've seen them in action. We know your strengths and weaknesses because we've made it our business to learn them. The implications of Chen's words were staggering. If humans had been observing galactic civilization without being detected, it suggested surveillance capabilities that went far beyond what most species possessed. The ability to watch Imperial fleets in action without being discovered implied technologies and techniques that could revolutionize warfare throughout the galaxy. Impossible, General Vexhai growled. Imperial space is protected by the finest sensor networks in the galaxy. No ship can approach our territory without detection. No civilization can spy on our forces without our knowledge. Chen's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering how much to reveal. General, you're making the same assumption that most galactic civilizations make, that space warfare requires large, obvious ships that can be detected by conventional sensors. Humans have taken a different approach to the problem. The human colonel gestured toward his delegation, and for the first time, the assembled aliens noticed that each member of the human team wore a small device that seemed to shift and blur when viewed directly. The devices were so subtle that they were almost impossible to focus on, creating an unsettling visual effect that made the humans seem slightly less real than their surroundings. Human technology development has always been driven by practical necessity rather than impressive appearance, Chen explained. We needed to observe without being observed, so we developed stealth capabilities that most species can't detect. We needed to gather information without triggering defensive responses, so we created surveillance methods that don't rely on conventional sensors. The casual revelation that humans possessed advanced stealth technology sent a wave of alarm through the crowd. Several species began urgent communications with their home governments, while others started calculating the implications of undetectable human vessels operating throughout galactic space. You speak of surveillance and stealth, Zarathek said, her voice tight with controlled fury, but such capabilities mean nothing in open combat. Stealth cannot hide a fleet during battle. Surveillance cannot stop plasma cannons or nuclear warheads. When the fighting begins, humans will learn the difference between watching wars and fighting them. Chen nodded as if acknowledging a valid point, but his expression suggested that the commander was still missing something important. You're absolutely right that stealth has limited value in direct combat, but you're assuming the humans would choose to fight the kind of war that Imperial doctrine is designed for. The human colonel's words carried an ominous undertone that suggested alternatives most species hadn't considered. Throughout galactic history, warfare had followed predictable patterns. Fleets met in space, armies clashed on planets, and victory went to those with superior firepower or numbers. The idea that humans might fight entirely different kinds of wars was deeply unsettling. Human military history is full of examples of smaller, weaker forces defeating larger, stronger enemies through unconventional tactics, Chen continued. We've learned that the best way to win a war isn't to fight the enemy on their terms, but to force them to fight on yours. We don't meet Imperial fleets in space because that would be playing to your strengths. We target your supply lines, your communication networks, your industrial bases, and your civilian populations until your fleets become irrelevant. The clinical description of human warfare shocked the assembled aliens into silence. Most galactic species viewed warfare as a contest between military forces, with civilian populations and infrastructure remaining largely untouched unless they directly supported combat operations. The idea of deliberately targeting civilian assets was considered barbaric by most civilized standards. You speak of targeting civilians as if it were a legitimate military tactic, Zarathek said, her voice filled with disgust. Such actions mark you as little better than pirates or terrorists. Civilized species do not wage war against the innocent. Chen's expression grew cold, and for the first time since entering the hall, his voice carried a note of genuine anger. Commander, humans learned a long time ago that there are no innocent bystanders in a war of extermination. When a species decides to conquer or destroy humanity, every member of that species becomes a legitimate target until they surrender or change their government's policy. The human colonel's words carried the weight of bitter experience, and several aliens in the crowd began to realize that they might be dealing with a species that had very different concepts of acceptable warfare than the rest of galactic civilization. "You see," Chen continued, his voice returning to its earlier conversational tone, "most species fight wars to prove their superiority or expand their territory or defend their honor. Humans fight wars to survive, and we've learned that survival doesn't leave room for civilized niceties about legitimate targets and proper conduct." The explanation of human military philosophy was deeply disturbing to creatures that viewed warfare as a formalized contest with rules and traditions that limited its scope and intensity. The idea of total war, where entire civilizations could become targets, suggested a level of ruthlessness that went beyond what most species considered acceptable. Zarathek found herself facing a dilemma that had never been covered in Imperial military doctrine. The humans weren't behaving like any species the Empire had previously encountered. They showed no fear, acknowledged no superiority, and seemed to view the assembled might of galactic civilization as nothing more than an interesting tactical problem to be solved. More disturbing still was the growing suspicion that the humans might actually be capable of backing up their quiet confidence with effective action. Their casual mention of observing Imperial forces, their detailed knowledge of galactic military doctrine, and their matter-of-fact discussion of unconventional warfare suggested a level of preparation that went far beyond simple arrogance. The commander's uncertainty was shared by many others in the hall, and the atmosphere began to shift from confident superiority to something approaching concern. What had started as an opportunity to humiliate an upstart species was becoming an encounter with something that might actually pose a threat to established galactic order. As the silence stretched on, Chun made another show of checking the device on his wrist. "Commander, we really do have other appointments, and this conversation seems to be going in circles. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting when you've had time to consider the implications of what we've discussed." The casual suggestion that the Imperial Command needed time to consider anything was another insult to creatures accustomed to making immediate decisions based on overwhelming advantages. But Zarathek found herself actually wanting that time to think, to consult with her superiors, and to develop a response to a situation that had no precedent in Imperial history. Before she could respond, however, a new voice cut through the tension in the hall. The voice belonged to someone the assembled aliens hadn't expected to see, someone whose presence would change everything about the encounter and force both humans and aliens to reassess everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the true nature of strength. The massive doors at the far end of the Imperial Hall groaned open with a sound like grinding stone, and every conversation in the chamber died instantly. Even the humans, who had shown no reaction to the various displays of alien aggression, turned their attention toward the entrance as something far more significant than military posturing made its presence known. Matriarch Thra entered the hall with the slow, measured gait of absolute authority. At nearly 9 feet tall, she dwarfed even the largest of the assembled aliens, but her true presence came from something far more intimidating than mere size. This was the being who had forged the Karathi Empire from dozens of warring factions, who had personally led the conquest of over 100 worlds, and who had never, in 3 centuries of rule, shown mercy to those who opposed her will. Her scales were the deep gold of ancient royalty, marked with ritual scars that told the story of countless victories in personal combat. Each of her 4 arms bore ceremonial weapons that had drawn the blood of enemies across the galaxy, and her eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had survived long enough to become legend. Every alien in the hall immediately prostrated themselves, dropping to the floor in the ultimate display of submission and respect. Even those species that normally showed deference only to their own kind recognized that they were in the presence of something that transcended normal hierarchies. The matriarch wasn't just the ruler of the Karathi Empire. She was the single most powerful individual in known galactic space. Zarathek's scales shifted to the pale gray of absolute terror as she realized that her confrontation with the humans had somehow attracted the personal attention of the Empire's supreme ruler. The matriarch rarely left her private chambers, and Her presence in the diplomatic hall could only mean that someone had made a mistake significant enough to warrant her direct intervention. The assembled crowd held its collective breath as Matriarch Thesera's gaze swept the chamber, taking in a scene of confrontation between Imperial forces and the human delegation. Her expression remained unreadable, but those who knew her well recognized the subtle signs of calculation in her posture. She was evaluating the situation with the same cold intelligence that had made her the most feared ruler in galactic history. What happened next defied every expectation and precedent in Imperial protocol. Instead of acknowledging her prostrate subjects or demanding explanations for the disturbance, the matriarch's attention fixed on Colonel Chun and his delegation. For a long moment, the most powerful being in the galaxy and the representative of humanity's newest members studied each other in silence. Then, to the absolute shock of every creature in the hall, Matriarch Thesera inclined her massive head in a gesture that unmistakably showed respect. Not the casual acknowledgement she might give to a useful subordinate, not the formal recognition she showed to allied rulers, but the genuine respect of one apex predator recognizing another. Colonel Marcus Chun. The matriarch's voice filled the chamber with the kind of authority that made entire star systems tremble. We have been expecting you for some time. Your reputation precedes you, as does your species' remarkable achievement in remaining hidden from galactic civilization for so long. The casual revelation that the matriarch not only knew Chen's name, but had been expecting his arrival sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Several aliens began urgent communications with their intelligence services, while others struggled to understand how the supreme ruler of the Empire could have knowledge that her own military commanders clearly lacked. Chen's response was to offer his own respectful nod, the kind of acknowledgement one professional might give to another. Matriarch Thesera, we appreciate the opportunity to finally meet in person. Your own reputation is well known among human leadership, and we've studied your strategic innovations with considerable interest. The exchange between the two leaders was conducted in tones of mutual respect that made the previous confrontation between humans and Imperial forces seem like children squabbling while adults conducted serious business. Several of the more perceptive aliens began to realize that they had been watching the opening moves of a game being played at levels far above their understanding. Zara Thek, still prostrated on the floor, felt her world shifting around her as she began to comprehend the magnitude of her error. She had been treating the humans like another inferior species to be bullied into submission, while the Empire's supreme ruler was acknowledging them as equals worthy of personal attention and respect. Rise, the matriarch commanded, and every alien in the hall immediately obeyed. But as they regained their feet, many noticed that the matriarch's attention remained focused on the human delegation rather than her own subjects. Commander Zurathek, explain to me why you have been threatening beings who are here under my personal invitation. The words hit Zarathek like a physical blow. Personal invitation from the matriarch was reserved for the most important diplomatic encounters, meetings that could determine the fate of entire civilizations. For her to have been conducting a routine intimidation display with beings under the matriarch's protection was a mistake that could cost her not just her rank, but her life. Matriarch, Zarathek's voice was barely above a whisper. The humans refused to kneel. They showed disrespect to the Empire and contempt for our traditions. I was enforcing proper protocol according to Imperial law. The silence that followed Zarathek's explanation was filled with the kind of tension that preceded executions. Every being in the hall understood that the commander had just admitted to threatening guests who enjoyed the highest level of Imperial protection, and such actions typically resulted in immediate and terminal consequences. But instead of the expected explosion of rage, the matriarch's response was a sound that took several moments for the assembled aliens to recognize. Laughter. Deep, genuine amusement that seemed to find Zarathek's mistake more entertaining than infuriating. Commander, the matriarch said when her laughter subsided, you have just demonstrated exactly why I chose to handle this meeting personally rather than trust it to military protocol. You attempted to force beings to kneel who have never knelt to anyone, including me. The revelation that the humans had refused to kneel, even to the matriarch herself, sent another wave of shock through the crowd. The idea that any being could show such disrespect to the Empire's supreme ruler and live was beyond the comprehension of most galactic species. The humans, the matriarch continued, are perhaps the only species in the galaxy who have earned the right to stand as equals in my presence. Not through conquest or intimidation, but through something far more valuable. They have proven themselves to be worthy opponents. Chen's expression showed a flicker of what might have been amusement at the matriarch's words. With respect, matriarch, humans prefer to think of potential allies rather than opponents. We've found that former enemies often make the most reliable partners, provided mutual respect can be established. The exchange between the two leaders carried undertones that suggested a history of interaction that none of the assembled aliens had been aware of. The casual familiarity with which they addressed each other implied previous contact, negotiations, or possibly even conflicts that had been kept secret from the general galactic community. Matriarch Thesera's mandibles clicked in what those familiar with Karathi expressions recognized as approval. Indeed, and mutual respect requires understanding the true nature of one's counterpart. Commander Zarathek, you made the mistake of judging humans by their appearance rather than their capabilities. Would you care to learn what those capabilities actually entail? The question was clearly rhetorical, but the matriarch gestured toward a series of holographic displays that materialized around the chamber. The images showed star systems, fleet formations, and tactical analyses that began to paint a picture of human capabilities that went far beyond anything the assembled aliens had imagined. Humans, the matriarch announced, have been active in galactic space for approximately 57 years. During that time, they have encountered 17 different species, participated in 12 conflicts, and emerged victorious in every engagement despite being outnumbered and outgunned in each case. The statistical summary was delivered with the clinical precision that made the matriarch's strategic analyses legendary throughout the Empire. But the numbers themselves were staggering, suggesting a level of military effectiveness that bordered on the impossible for such a young species. More significantly, the matriarch continued, humans have demonstrated tactical innovations that have revolutionized our understanding of space warfare. Their development of practical cloaking technology, their advancement of automated weapon systems, and their integration of artificial intelligence with military command structures represent advances that most civilizations require centuries to achieve. Each revelation about human capabilities was accompanied by holographic displays that showed technologies and techniques that several alien species immediately recognized as representing quantum leaps beyond current galactic standards. The assembled crowd began to understand that they had been witnessing not the humbling of primitives, but the introduction of a species that might represent the next evolutionary step in galactic civilization. General Vex High, his confidence shaken by the matriarch's revelations, found the courage to speak. Matriarch, if humans possess such advanced capabilities, why did they remain hidden for so long? Why reveal themselves now? The question was one that had been troubling several observers, and the matriarch's response provided insights into human strategic thinking that were both illuminating and disturbing. Humans, the matriarch explained, are perhaps the most patient species we have ever encountered. They spent decades observing galactic civilization, learning our strengths and weaknesses, and developing countermeasures to our most advanced technologies. They revealed themselves only when they were confident they could defend their interests against any possible threat. The explanation of human strategic patience was deeply unsettling to species that measured success in terms of immediate conquest and expansion. The idea of a civilization that would spend decades in preparation before making its move suggested a level of long-term planning that went far beyond normal strategic thinking. But patience, the matriarch continued, is only part of human strategic doctrine. They also possess something that most galactic civilizations have lost, the ability to adapt their tactics to match changing circumstances. They don't fight the same war twice, and they learn from every encounter. Chun nodded acknowledgement of the matriarch's assessment. We found that flexibility is more valuable than raw strength in most situations. The ability to change tactics, adapt technologies, and modify strategies based on new information has served us well in encounters with species that rely on traditional approaches to conflict. The human colonel's matter-of-fact discussion of adaptive warfare sent chills through listeners who had built their military doctrines around proven historical methods. The idea that humans could modify their entire approach to conflict based on the specific characteristics of each opponent suggested a level of tactical sophistication that most species couldn't match. Which brings us, the matriarch said, her tone growing more serious, to the reason for this meeting. Humans have requested formal recognition as an independent civilization, with all the rights and protections that such status entails under galactic law. The announcement that humans were seeking formal recognition as an independent species rather than asking to join the Empire was another surprise for the assembled aliens. Most newly discovered civilizations either requested membership in existing power structures or were conquered and absorbed against their will. The idea of a species demanding recognition as equals was unprecedented in recent galactic history. Such recognition, the matriarch continued, requires demonstration of certain capabilities. The ability to defend one's territory, the capacity for interstellar commerce, and the possession of technologies that contribute to galactic civilization's advancement. The formal requirements for species recognition were well known to most galactic civilizations, but they had been developed with the assumption that applicant species would be seeking protection or partnership. For humans to be seeking recognition, while clearly capable of defending themselves, suggested motivations that went beyond simple survival. Humans, the matriarch announced, have exceeded every requirement for independent recognition. Their defensive capabilities have been proven through practical demonstration. Their commercial potential is evident in their technological innovations, and their contributions to galactic advancement are already being integrated into Imperial strategic doctrine. The casual mention that the Empire was already incorporating human innovations into its own military planning was perhaps the most significant revelation of the entire encounter. For the Karathi Empire to adopt tactics or technologies from another species was an acknowledgement of superiority that had never been granted to any other civilization. Zarathek, her understanding of the situation finally, catching up with reality, found herself facing the full magnitude of her error. She had been attempting to intimidate beings who not only enjoyed the matriarch's protection, but whose capabilities had already been recognized as superior to Imperial standards. Her actions hadn't just been disrespectful, they had been catastrophically misinformed. The commander's growing panic was evident to everyone in the hall, including the humans, who seemed to view her distress with something approaching sympathy. Chen's expression suggested that he understood the position she found herself in and bore no personal animosity towards someone who had simply been following what she thought was proper protocol. But the matriarch's next words made clear that understanding the situation and being forgiven for mishandling it were two very different things. When she spoke again, her voice carried the cold finality that had preceded the destruction of countless enemies throughout her reign. Commander Zarathek, the matriarch said, you have demonstrated a failure of intelligence, judgment, and diplomatic protocol that threatens the Empire's relationship with a civilization whose friendship could determine our future survival. Such failures cannot be overlooked or forgiven. The words fell on the assembled crowd like a death sentence, and several aliens began calculating their own exposure to potential consequences. Anyone who had supported Zarathek's confrontation with the humans might find themselves sharing her fate, while those who had remained neutral could only hope their silence would be interpreted as wisdom rather than cowardice. But before the matriarch could pronounce whatever judgment she had in mind, Colonel Chun surprised everyone by stepping forward and speaking in a voice that carried unmistakable authority. Matriarch, Chun said respectfully, but firmly, if I may suggest an alternative approach to this situation. Human diplomatic doctrine includes provisions for educational rather than punitive responses to misunderstandings between species with different cultural backgrounds. The human colonel's intervention on behalf of someone who had just threatened him was unexpected enough to capture everyone's attention, but his suggestion that humans had developed formal protocols for handling intercultural conflicts implied a sophistication in diplomatic thinking that matched their apparent military capabilities. The matriarch's expression showed genuine interest in Chen's suggestion, and her response would determine not just Zarathek's fate, but the entire future relationship between humanity and the most powerful empire in galactic space. The matriarch's golden scales shifted subtly as she considered Colonel Chen's unexpected intervention. Throughout her centuries of rule, she had rarely encountered beings willing to advocate for those who had wronged them, and the human suggestion that education might be preferable to punishment represented a philosophical approach that challenged traditional imperial thinking. "Elaborate," the matriarch commanded, her voice carrying the kind of focused attention that had made her strategic sessions legendary throughout the empire. What form would this educational approach take, and what purpose would it serve beyond allowing incompetence to go unpunished? Chen's response demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking that had already impressed the matriarch during their previous secret communications. Matriarch, human experience suggests that punishment tends to eliminate individuals who make mistakes, while education transforms them into more effective assets. Commander Zurithek's error wasn't born of malice or deliberate disrespect, but of incomplete information about human capabilities and intentions. The colonel gestured toward the assembled crowd of alien dignitaries, many of whom were still processing the revelation that their assumptions about human weakness had been completely wrong. Most of the beings in this hall share the commander's misconceptions about humanity. Punishing her for acting on information that was provided by your own intelligence services would eliminate someone who could become a valuable ally while leaving the underlying problem unaddressed. The logic of Chen's argument was undeniable, even to species that traditionally viewed mercy as weakness. The human was suggesting that Zarethek's mistake was symptomatic of a larger intelligence failure that affected the entire Imperial command structure, and that addressing the individual without correcting the systemic issue would be strategically counterproductive. Matriarch Thessera's mandibles clicked thoughtfully as she evaluated the human's proposal. "You suggest that Commander Zarethek's misconceptions reflect broader intelligence failures within the Empire. What evidence supports this assessment?" Chen's smile returned, but this time it carried no edge of threat or amusement. Instead, it reflected the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had asked exactly the right question. "Matriarch, your own intelligence services have been tracking human activities for less than 2 years, despite our presence in galactic space for over 5 decades. Your strategic assessments of human capabilities are approximately 60% accurate, which is impressive but still leaves significant gaps in understanding." The casual revelation that humans had been aware of Imperial surveillance efforts sent another wave of alarm through the assembled crowd. Several species began urgent calculations of their own intelligence vulnerabilities, while others wondered what other capabilities humans might possess that had escaped detection. Furthermore, Chun continued, "The standard Imperial protocol for handling new species contact assumes that superior technology correlates with superior physical development, that military strength can be assessed through visual inspection, and that species behavior can be predicted based on evolutionary characteristics. These assumptions are reasonable when dealing with most galactic civilizations, but they don't apply to humanity." The systematic deconstruction of Imperial intelligence methodology was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone Chun had used throughout the encounter, but its implications were staggering. The human was suggesting that the entire foundation of Imperial strategic analysis was flawed when applied to species that didn't follow normal evolutionary patterns. General Vex High, still struggling to reconcile his assessment of human weakness with the matriarch's revelations about their capabilities, found the courage to challenge Chen's assertions. "If Imperial intelligence methods are so flawed, how do you explain our successful expansion across 300 worlds? How do you account for our victory over species far more advanced than humanity claims to be?" The general's questions reflected the confusion felt by many in the hall. Creatures who had built their understanding of the galaxy on the assumption that the Karathi Empire's success proved the validity of their methods. Chen's response would either validate their worldview or force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about power and strength. "General," Chen replied respectfully, "Imperial methods work extremely well for dealing with species that developed along conventional evolutionary paths. Your intelligence assessments are accurate when applied to civilizations that follow predictable patterns of technological and social development. The problem is that humans represent something new in galactic civilization." The human colonel paused, seeming to consider how much to reveal about humanity's unique characteristics. When he continued, His words carried implications that would reshape galactic understanding of evolutionary possibilities. Most species develop along single tracks, Chen explained. They optimize for specific environmental conditions, social structures, or survival strategies. They become very good at particular approaches to problem solving, but they lose flexibility in the process. Humans developed along multiple tracks simultaneously, optimizing for adaptability rather than specialization. The explanation of human evolutionary strategy was profoundly disturbing to species that had built their identities around their specialized advantages. The idea of a civilization that could match or exceed their capabilities across multiple domains suggested possibilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. This evolutionary flexibility, Chun continued, means that humans can compete effectively with species that should have overwhelming advantages in their areas of specialization. We can match the tactical thinking of warrior races, exceed the technological innovation of research civilizations, and outmaneuver the strategic planning of ancient empires. The casual claim that humans could compete with the galaxy's most advanced species in their own areas of expertise would have been dismissed as arrogance if it hadn't been delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence. Several aliens began urgent reviews of their own strategic assumptions about human capabilities. Matriarch Thessera's expression showed the kind of focused interest that had made her legendary strategic sessions so effective. Colonel Chun, you suggest that human adaptability represents a new evolutionary paradigm. What specific advantages does this provide in practical applications? The matriarch's question carried undertones that suggested she was testing Chen's understanding of concepts that went beyond simple military considerations. Her interest seemed focused on implications that transcended immediate tactical concerns. The primary advantage, Chen replied, is that humans can modify their approach to match changing circumstances without losing core effectiveness. Traditional species optimization means that most civilizations have predictable responses to specific challenges. Humans can change their response patterns, making us extremely difficult to counter through conventional strategic planning. The explanation of adaptive strategic doctrine sent chills through listeners who had built their military careers on the assumption that enemy behavior could be predicted based on historical patterns. The idea of opponents who could fundamentally alter their approach to conflict represented a level of uncertainty that made traditional strategic planning obsolete. For example, Chun continued, imperial doctrine assumes that species with advanced technology will rely primarily on that technology for military solutions. When faced with superior imperial firepower, most civilizations attempt to match that advantage through technological development or alliance building. Humans might choose to abandon advanced technology entirely and resort to primitive methods that imperial forces aren't prepared to counter. The casual mention of deliberately adopting primitive tactics as a strategic advantage was deeply unsettling to creatures who equated technological advancement with military superiority. The idea that humans might willingly give up advanced capabilities to gain tactical advantages challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of progress and power. Zarathek, still processing the magnitude of her misjudgment, found herself beginning to understand why the humans had shown no fear despite being obviously outnumbered and apparently outgunned. They weren't relying on their visible capabilities to protect them. They were counting on their ability to adapt to whatever situation developed. This adaptability, Chun said, his tone growing more serious, is also why humans prefer education to punishment when dealing with intercultural conflicts. We've learned that destroying potential assets because they acted on incomplete information is less effective than providing them with better information and observing how they adapt to new understanding. The human colonel's explanation of educational philosophy carried implications that went far beyond diplomatic considerations. He was suggesting that humans viewed even their enemies as potential resources to be developed rather than threats to be eliminated, a perspective that represented a fundamental departure from traditional galactic thinking about conflict resolution. Commander Zarathek, Chun said, addressing the Karathi officer directly for the first time since the matriarch's arrival, demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking that makes the imperial military so effective. She assessed the situation based on available information, identified what she perceived as a threat to imperial authority, and took immediate action to address that threat. Her methods were sound. Only her information was incomplete. The generous assessment of Zarathek's performance was unexpected enough to draw gasps of surprise from several aliens in the crowd. Chen was not only advocating for someone who had threatened him, but he was finding positive aspects in her conduct that demonstrated professional respect for her capabilities. With complete information about human capabilities and intentions, Chun continued, Commander Zarathek could become one of the most effective liaison officers between Imperial and human forces. Her willingness to take decisive action, combined with accurate intelligence, could serve both civilizations extremely well. The suggestion that Zarathek might be valuable as a human liaison rather than a threat to be eliminated represented exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that Chun had been describing. Instead of viewing her as an enemy to be defeated, he was proposing to transform her into an asset that could benefit both species. Matriarch Thesura's scales shifted to the deep green that indicated profound thoughtfulness among her people. Chen's proposal represented more than simple mercy. It demonstrated a strategic approach to problem-solving that could revolutionize imperial diplomatic doctrine. Colonel Chun, the matriarch said slowly, you propose to transform a potential enemy into an ally through education rather than intimidation. This approach contradicts centuries of imperial tradition, but your logic is compelling. The admission that human thinking might improve upon imperial methods was perhaps the most significant statement the matriarch had ever made in the presence of other species. For the supreme ruler of the galaxy's most powerful empire to acknowledge that another civilization might have superior approaches to problem-solving was an unprecedented recognition of human capabilities. Furthermore, the matriarch continued, your willingness to advocate for someone who threatened you demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic thinking that makes humans so effective. You see potential assets where others see only problems to be eliminated. The matriarch's analysis of Chen's motivations carried implications that several aliens were only beginning to understand. The humans weren't just demonstrating superior military or technological capabilities. They were showing a fundamentally different approach to strategic thinking that could change the nature of galactic civilization itself. Very well, the matriarch announced, her voice carrying the finality of absolute authority. Commander Zarathek will be assigned as liaison to human diplomatic operations, effective immediately. She will learn human methods, study human capabilities, and serve as a bridge between imperial and human strategic thinking. The announcement that Zarathek was being reassigned rather than punished sent ripples of relief and amazement through the crowd. But the matriarch's next words made clear that this was not simply an act of mercy, but a strategic decision with implications that extended far beyond individual careers. This reassignment, the matriarch continued, will serve as a test case for human educational methods. If Commander Zarathek proves effective in her new role, other Imperial officers will receive similar training. If human approaches to asset development prove superior to traditional methods, Imperial doctrine will be modified accordingly. The casual announcement that the Empire might adopt human training methods represented a revolution in Imperial thinking that would have been unimaginable before this encounter. For the Karathi Empire to consider modifying its fundamental approaches based on human innovations was an acknowledgement of superiority that went beyond simple military considerations. Chen's response to the matriarch's decision demonstrated the same diplomatic skill that had characterized his entire performance. We appreciate your confidence in human educational methods, matriarch. Commander Zarathek will find that human training approaches are designed to enhance existing capabilities rather than replace them with alien alternatives. The assurance that human education would build upon rather than replace existing imperial strengths was exactly what the assembled aliens needed to hear. Chun was proposing enhancement rather than replacement, improvement rather than abandonment of proven methods. But as the formal ceremonies began to wind down and the assembled aliens started to process the implications of what they had witnessed, none of them could have predicted the final surprise that would cap an already unprecedented encounter. The humans had one more revelation that would force everyone present to completely recalculate their understanding of humanity's place in the galactic order. As the formal protocols of Commander Zarathek's reassignment were being finalized, Colonel Chun made a subtle gesture to his delegation that caused them to shift their positions slightly around the chamber. To most observers, the movement appeared casual, but several of the more militarily experienced aliens recognized it as a defensive formation designed to control key sight lines and exit routes. Matriarch Thessera, whose strategic awareness had kept her alive and in power for 3 centuries, immediately noticed the change in human positioning. Her mandibles clicked in what might have been approval or concern as she realized that the humans had been maintaining tactical readiness throughout an encounter that had appeared purely diplomatic. Colonel Chun, the matriarch said, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Your delegation has maintained combat formations throughout our discussion, despite the apparent resolution of all immediate conflicts. What threat assessment protocols are your people following? The question was delivered with the kind of professional interest that one military commander might show for another's tactical doctrine, but it also served as a subtle test of human honesty and strategic thinking. Chin's response would determine whether the humans were truly as forthright as they appeared or whether they were concealing additional concerns. Chin's smile returned, but this time it carried an edge that suggested the humans had been waiting for exactly this question. Matriarch, human tactical doctrine is based on the principle that diplomatic encounters are simply another form of warfare, conducted with different weapons, but requiring the same level of preparation and strategic thinking. The casual equating of diplomacy with warfare sent a chill through the assembled aliens that had nothing to do with the chamber's climate control. Most galactic civilizations maintained clear distinctions between diplomatic and military operations, treating them as fundamentally different categories of interaction that required different skills and approaches. More specifically, Chun continued, we maintain defensive positioning because human intelligence has identified at least 3 potential threats to this meeting that Imperial security appears to have overlooked. The revelation that humans had detected security vulnerabilities that Imperial forces had missed was perhaps even more disturbing than their earlier claims about military capabilities. The Karathi Empire's security services were considered among the best in the galaxy, and their ability to protect high-level diplomatic meetings was legendary. Matriarch Thessera's scales shifted to the deep purple that indicated extreme alertness among her people. Elaborate on these perceived threats, Colonel. Imperial security protocols are comprehensive and have never failed to protect gatherings of this importance. Chin's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were calculating how much to reveal about human intelligence capabilities. When he spoke again, his words carried implications that would force a complete reevaluation of galactic security standards. Matriarch, human surveillance has detected the presence of at least 12 individuals in this chamber who are not what they appear to be. 7 are carrying concealed weapons that should have been detected by your security scanners. 3 are broadcasting encrypted communications to locations outside this facility. And 2 appear to be members of species that should not possess the technology necessary to achieve such sophisticated disguises. The systematic revelation of security breaches sent the assembled crowd into barely controlled panic. Several aliens began examining their neighbors with new suspicion, while others frantically checked their own security devices for signs of the infiltration Chun had described. But what truly terrified the assembled dignitaries was the casual competence with which Chun delivered his assessment. He wasn't guessing or bluffing. He was providing specific intelligence that could only come from surveillance capabilities far beyond what most galactic civilizations possessed. Furthermore, Chun continued, human intelligence has identified at least 4 different plots currently in motion that could affect the outcome of these proceedings. 2 involve attempts to assassinate key participants. 1 involves sabotage of the station's life support systems, and 1 appears to be an effort to discredit the entire diplomatic process through manufactured evidence of human aggression. The revelation that multiple hostile operations were targeting the meeting forced even the most skeptical aliens to reconsider their assessment of human capabilities. The level of intelligence penetration required to detect such operations suggested surveillance and analysis capabilities that exceeded anything in the known galaxy. Matriarch Thessera's response demonstrated exactly why she had become the most feared and respected ruler in galactic civilization. Instead of panic or disbelief, She showed the kind of cold calculation that had made her strategic decisions legendary throughout the empire. Fascinating, the matriarch said, her voice carrying deadly calm. Human intelligence capabilities appear to exceed our own by significant margins. I assume your people have developed countermeasures for these identified threats. Chen's nod confirmed what several perceptive observers had already begun to suspect. The humans hadn't just detected the various plots. They had been prepared to counter them. Human doctrine includes provisions for defensive action when diplomatic encounters are compromised by hostile interference. However, we prefer to coordinate such actions with local security forces when possible. The offer to coordinate with Imperial security was delivered with the same diplomatic courtesy Chun had shown throughout the encounter, but it carried an undertone that suggested human capabilities extended far beyond simple detection. They could apparently act to counter threats that Imperial forces hadn't even identified. Colonel Chun, the matriarch said, her tone carrying the authority of absolute command, I hereby authorize human security forces to take whatever action they deem necessary to protect this gathering. Imperial security will provide full cooperation and support. The authorization for humans to take independent security action within the heart of Imperial space was unprecedented in galactic history. For the matriarch to grant such authority to another species represented a level of trust and respect that had never been extended to any foreign power. Chen's response was to activate a device on his wrist that sent a barely perceptible signal to his delegation. The reaction was immediate and devastating to anyone who had underestimated human capabilities. The humans moved with a precision and efficiency that made their earlier positioning seem casual by comparison. Within seconds, they had identified and neutralized 12 infiltrators, secured 7 concealed weapons, disabled 4 jamming devices, and isolated 3 individuals who were later revealed to be shape-shifting assassins from a species that supposedly existed only in legend. The speed and efficiency of human action left the assembled aliens stunned and silent. What they had witnessed wasn't just superior training or better equipment. It was a level of tactical coordination that suggested capabilities beyond what most species could achieve even with decades of preparation. But perhaps most disturbing was the casual competence with which the humans had executed their security sweep. They showed no signs of stress, excitement, or satisfaction at their success. Instead, they simply returned to their original positions, as if neutralizing a complex multi-species assassination plot was simply part of routine diplomatic procedure. Threat assessment complete. Chen reported to the matriarch in the same conversational tone he had used throughout the encounter. All immediate risks have been neutralized, and the facility is secure for continued operations. Human security teams had detained the identified infiltrators for questioning and evidence collection. The matter-of-fact report on what would have been the most significant security operation in recent Imperial history was delivered as if Chun were discussing routine maintenance rather than saving the lives of everyone in the chamber. Matriarch Thisera's expression showed a mixture of admiration and calculation that few beings had ever seen from the galaxy's most powerful ruler. Colonel Chun, human capabilities continue to exceed our assessments. Your people appear to possess intelligence, security, and tactical capabilities that surpass our own in every measurable category. The admission was perhaps the most significant statement the matriarch had ever made in the presence of foreign representatives. For the supreme ruler of the galaxy's most powerful empire to acknowledge another species' superiority in multiple domains was an unprecedented recognition that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. With respect, matriarch, Chen replied, human capabilities are simply optimized for different challenges than those faced by most galactic civilizations. We found that survival in a hostile universe requires a broader range of skills than most species develop through normal evolution. The diplomatic response deflected direct claims of superiority while acknowledging the fundamental differences in human development that had produced such impressive capabilities. Chun was offering an explanation that preserved the dignity of other species while making clear that humanity represented something new in galactic civilization. Indeed, the matriarch said, her mandibles clicking in what seasoned observers recognized as profound satisfaction. And this brings us to the true purpose of today's meeting. Colonel Chun, your people have requested formal recognition as an independent civilization, but that request was merely the opening move in a much larger strategy. The matriarch's words carried an undertone that suggested she understood implications that had escaped most of the other observers. The meeting between humans and imperial forces was apparently part of a plan that extended far beyond simple diplomatic recognition. Human intelligence capabilities, the matriarch continued, have undoubtedly provided your leadership with detailed assessments of every major power in galactic civilization. Your strategic planning has certainly identified opportunities for alliance, expansion, and influence that could reshape the balance of power throughout known space. The systematic analysis of human strategic position was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that had made the matriarch's tactical assessments legendary. She was laying out the implications of human capabilities with the same thoroughness that had made her the most effective military commander in galactic history. Chen's expression showed genuine respect for the matriarch's strategic insight. Your analysis is remarkable.